Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 2 of our 3-part series on Archetypal Synchronistic Resonance. With me is Dr. Brendan Engen, a clinical psychologist from Waycross, Georgia, and the co-author with me of a paper published back in 2007 in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology called Archetypal Synchronistic Resonance, a New Theory of Paranormal Experience. Welcome again, Brendan.
Thank you.
Let's recap a bit for our viewers who may not have seen the first episode in this 3-part series.
Yes. Well, we were discussing our new theory of paranormal experience, archetypal synchronistic resonance.
Yeah.
And essentially we were defining terms. We talked about how the experience involves an archetypal content, a deep unconscious content. There's a synchronicity that's also involved in
or a series.
Or a series, indeed.
Yeah.
That's right. A series of synchronicities sometimes. And then a resonance factor, which has to do with a feeling of affinity, likeness, sympathy with someone who may be separated from us by vast stretches of time or space. And in our case, it had to do with resonating with someone or people that lived thousands of years
ago. An ancient Roman philosopher, Seneca.
That's right.
And you were identified, I guess, by the trance medium Kevin Ryerson.
That's right. Yes.
Or trance channel, as he likes to be called, as a student of Seneca.
That's right.
Or a colleague.
That's right. He said that I had been a student of Seneca's. Living in a rural area, which is interesting, and that there were various things that he discussed, but he said that I was deeply influenced by Seneca's work and deeply affected by the suicide as well. And that was one of the issues, according to Ryerson, that I ended up having to kind of work on in subsequent incarnations.
Seneca committed suicide.
Right,
he was ordered to do so.
He was ordered to do so. That's right.
By a Roman centurion, because the Emperor Nero, who had been Seneca's student,
yes,
believed that Seneca was implicated in a conspiracy.
Right.
And that the conspirators, in fact, I believe it's true, the conspirators wished to replace Nero with Seneca.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
I don't think there's any evidence that Seneca was directly involved.
I don't think he was. Yeah.
Nero was afraid of him.
Exactly.
And Seneca did, in fact, take his own life.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And that was something that the trance medium Kevin Ryerson had touched on. And, and as I said in the earlier taping, that conversation with Kevin was very meaningful. It was very intriguing to me and inspired me to contact you.
In other words, the idea that in a past lifetime you never really got over the suicide of your friend and mentor has been affecting you for all of these generations.
Yes, that was
and that made some sense to you.
It made some sense. I could kind of connect with that in some way.
And now we're getting into some of the psychological, emotional dynamics of the archetypal synchronistic resonance, because in addition to there being archetypes and synchronicities and a resonance, there needs to be certain qualitative inner experiences associated with that, a sense of numinosity.
Yes,
for example.
Absolutely.
Let's define that term.
Yes, absolutely. Numinosity has to do with the feeling of being, as it were, overwhelmed or sort of overshadowed by a divine force or entity that one's encountering that seems vastly superior in power and wisdom and so forth. The Numinous experience kind of conveys with it a sense of divine validation. Actually, Homer described the numinous amongst like Priam, the character Priam, when he was...
We're talking about the Iliad,
the Iliad,
Odyssey.
that's right.
Yeah.
When Priam had an encounter, according to Homer, with Hermes, who appeared to him as a little boy, and he said that when he saw him, he knew immediately that this was no mere boy. And as he said, his hair stood up on end, and he felt overwhelmed by the experience, but the boy led him across the battle line to go find his friend or his son, I think, as I recall.
If I recall the story, now Priam is the father of Hector,
that's
the
right,
hero of the Trojans.
Yes.
He's the king of the Trojans.
That's right.
And his son has been killed by Achilles, and he walks through the Greek battle lines and meets with Achilles directly.
That's right.
So he's guided by a divine spirit.
That's absolutely.
And
absolutely.
He has this sense of numinosity.
He has this sense of numinosity. I think, in a Christian context, the experience that Paul described in the road to Damascus, where he felt like he heard the voice of Christ speaking to him. No one else seemed to be hearing it around him, only him, but he fell off his horse. He was really kind of dumbstruck by it. That's an example as well of a numinous experience. Right. So it can, depending on the tradition one's involved in, it can kind of take a different form, I think. But so these experiences do have that aspect, a numinous aspect.
Right. You also drew on some other psychological theories. For example, Abraham Maslow's notion of the peak experience.
Absolutely. And the peak experience has to do with an experience of actualizing maximal potential within oneself. And as he said, tends to be accompanied by a feeling sometimes of ecstasy or elation. You often will have a sense of timelessness. You're not really aware of where you are or what's going on necessarily. There's a sense of kind of tremendous joy and fulfillment.
And Maslow wrote, incidentally, he was a big influence on me when I was an undergraduate. Because he said, we think of these peak experiences as being associated with psychopathology.
Right.
He said, but he found that the most creative, most productive people, the Eleanor Roosevelts of the world, the Albert Einsteins of the world, had peak experiences. That these were not simply, the Freudians were dismissing them as infantile regression into a kind of oceanic oneness, like going back to the womb. He said it's not regression, it's actualization.
That's right, exactly. It's a further development, absolutely. And as you pointed out, there are things that potentially all of us can experience. He even said that athletics or sex or any kind of major achievement sometimes can.
When I was an undergraduate, I wrote a senior honors thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism with the idea of proving or showing why all of these mystics were so misguided. And when I encountered Maslow's writing, I realized maybe I had it backwards.
Right. That's interesting. Absolutely.
But you also drew upon, in writing the paper, and I have to credit you, you're really the primary author, the person who put pen to paper and wrote. I did contribute some ideas and some thoughts, but you did the work. Anyhow, you drew upon another concept called supermeaning.
Yes.
By Viktor Frankl.
Viktor Frankl, and he was a psychiatrist that had lived through the Holocaust. And,
the founder of logotherapy.
And the cornerstone of his theory was aligning oneself with meaning in life, and that meaning could be anything as simple as committing oneself, let's say, to a political cause or a relationship, or something even more encompassing or loftier that might encompass a religious kind of vocation, or something that fills one with a sense of purpose and direction. And a super meaning is a further development of that idea. And he said that has to do with, essentially, with the meaning of the whole, so to speak.
A transcendental
meaning. And it's so large that we can't even comprehend it. It has to do with kind of the source of meaning itself. So therefore our minds can't really penetrate it. and we know it's there. We know it's active and it's energizing, but we can't quite wrap our minds around it. And so in that way, it certainly falls in line with Otto's account of the Numinous.
Rudolf Otto.
Rudolf Otto, that's right.
Who is a philosopher and theologian.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Anyhow, so we're talking about not just synchronicities in passing or an idea of reincarnation in passing, but something that kind of grabs you to the core.
That's right.
And that's right. How you felt.
Absolutely. There's a kind of existential engagement with it.
And I had a similar experience when I first encountered Seneca.
Yes,
and it was quite unusual because for me, it happened while I was taping one of the old Thinking Aloud series back in about 1988 or so. I interviewed Dr. Martin Rossman, a hypnotist, and he was demonstrating a hypnotic principle. He hypnotized me on camera, so I still have this. And he said, "You are going to experience your inner healing advisor."
Yes.
He said, "It could be anything." He said, "It might be a chipmunk." And in trance, I had this experience of a being coming to me wearing a Roman toga. And at first I thought to myself, this must be, I thought, here's what I thought. My logical mind was thinking, okay, Greek, Roman toga. I want to improve my public speaking. I want you to be Demosthenes, the great orator, and you'll help me with my public speaking. I could use that. And this figure said, "No, I'm not Demosthenes."
Interesting.
I said, "Well, who are you?" I said, "I'm Seneca."
Yes.
And I said, "Okay, Seneca, now you're here. You're my inner healing advisor.
Yes.
What would you like me to do?" And Seneca said, "Study my life."
Yes, yes.
I knew very little, almost nothing about Seneca at that point in time, but I came out of that trance session. It's on videotape with this silly grin on my face, like, whoa. And then I began studying the life of Seneca. I learned that he's one of the most remarkable figures in human history. He was not a novelist, a playwright, and a philosopher, and a politician. He literally ran the Roman Empire for 5 years.
Absolutely.
He was the tutor to the Emperor Nero, but he had also been exiled by the previous emperor Claudius.
Yes, yes.
And lived in a lonely, barren island for a while. He lived like an ascetic, although he was the richest man in the empire. He slept on a hard bed. He became a vegetarian.
That's right.
Quite an unusual figure, so unusual even the early Christian fathers wanted to claim him as a Christian.
That's right.
Although he was not, he was a Stoic philosopher. In any case, I became enraptured by studying his life. And then I read about his death, where he had been ordered to commit suicide by a Roman centurion at the orders of the emperor. And the writer said, perhaps in all of human history, nobody was more prepared to face their death than Seneca, other than perhaps Socrates.
Yes, indeed, that's right.
Seneca turned to the centurion and he said, "Well, may I at least write out my last will and testament before I take my life?" And the centurion said, "No, there's no time for that."
Right.
So he was at a dinner party with friends, and he turned to his friends and he said, "Well, I bequeath you my life."
Yes, yes.
Study my life. That's all I can give you.
Yeah.
And that resonated for me with what he had said, study my life.
Absolutely,
I thought, my gosh, he's repeating what were his last words.
Absolutely,
in a hypnotic trance. Now, this occurred for me months after the original experience.
Yes.
It occurred... I think of it as a synchronicity, but it's not in the Jungian sense. No. Nothing was happening simultaneous to that.
Exactly.
It reached across time, thousands of years, but it affected me deep in my core.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So there I am making a pilgrimage to the city where Seneca was born, Cordoba, Spain,
Yes.
and you, which a magnificent city, if ever there was. The old Roman bridge is still there that Seneca himself must have walked across.
Yes,
and
yes.
it's also got a mosque from the era when the city was a Muslim city before the expulsion of the Muslims in 1492, and cathedrals. And in any case, you and I communicated.
Yes,
and you asked me, do I think I was the incarnation of Seneca, as had been suggested by our friend Kevin?
Right.
And I said, no, of course not. I'm not Seneca. He's a hero figure to me.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't be Seneca, at least that's the way I conceive of it.
Yes.
But I think there's a synchronistic resonance.
Yes.
And the fact that you were writing to me just as I am about to embark on a journey to the city of Seneca's birth reinforced that idea in my mind.
Absolutely.
And you wrote back and said, well, you ought to write that up.
That's right. That's exactly.
Nobody had published that idea before.
Yes.
And over time I suggested, I think it was a couple of years or so before we got it published.
Yes,
but, I suggested, well, maybe we can write this together.
Yes, absolutely. And that was an amazing experience. You know, it was really interesting about, I remember when you sent the email to me, I read the email in a way that's exactly what I think my psyche was looking for, because like I said before, in terms of making sense of the experience, speaking to the medium, because on the one hand, I couldn't accept it literally. Part of me just thought, I just can't. I can't quite, align myself with that literally.
Even though you had a strong affinity.
Even though I had a strong emotional reaction to it, but I just couldn't believe in the literal content of it. But at the same time, I couldn't dismiss it and say, well, it's meaningless or it's not worth looking at. And so in a way, what your response to it really spoke to me as well, as a way of kind of integrating something that...
Well, in all fairness to the theory of reincarnation, as I understand it, you are different people. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Seneca was Seneca.
That's
it doesn't mean that there couldn't have been some spiritual connection.
Right.
I'm comfortable thinking of it as archetypal and synchronistic and a resonance. But if somebody were to say, your soul was once in the body of Seneca, or you share a soul group of sorts with that person. Well, those are alternative ways of conceptualizing it. I'm a little less comfortable with them, but I'd be more comfortable if I had actual memories.
Well, exactly, and that was precisely my feeling as well. I have no memories of that. I have these kind of visceral reactions, but I have no real memories, that was kind of my reasoning as well.
Although, as I described to you last night, it's worth repeating because it was very real. A couple of months ago, I was attending an awards banquet and participating and receiving an award for our business, and thinking, well, we didn't get all the awards we were hoping to get. And then I've had this flash. It lasted only a second or two. It was very intense, and it was like, there I was back in ancient Rome in the palace of Nero, and Seneca receiving every accolade and award and financial reward that was possible in the greatest empire of its day.
Absolutely.
And, it felt very real to me for a second or two.
That's really interesting. Absolutely.
So I want to be open to that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Now you experienced another synchronicity.
I did, and it was that also really kind of struck me. Very revealing. Absolutely. A few days after our email exchange, as I recall, my wife and I went to a neighboring town, Walnut Creek, to have dinner with friends, and before dinner we went to a bookstore, and I frequent bookstores quite a lot, so that I was immediately drawn to their to their section on philosophy books and psychology books and so forth. And I saw a book there that just immediately grabbed my attention, and it was called The Looking Glass God, written by, I think his name was Nahum Stiskin, I believe. Stiskin, excuse
Nahum
me.
Stiskin.
Stiskin, that's right. And I was very intrigued by it. I kind of thumbed through it and read different portions. I just decided to buy it. That's the only book I bought, actually. Yeah. Usually I come back with a handful. And then later, after we, sometime after, I was looking through the book, and on the very first page, I noticed an inscription, and it, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was stated, but it said, Jeffrey Mishlove, The Mind's Ear, received 1972, as I recall. And that just kind of blew me away. I thought, oh my God, how is that possible? That's so strange.
You bought a book that I had once owned.
That you bought a book that you had once owned decades before. And I had,
within a few days of making contact with me.
That's right. That's right. And I thought, this is startling.
But not just any book.
It's not just any book, because it's a book kind of on the godhead archetype.
Yes.
He talks about, as I recall, he talks about Taoism, Shintoism, and Western philosophical theology, and he kind of comes up with his own account, and he promotes or defends this idea of the looking glass God.
And he invokes the yin-yang image, which, of course, viewers of this program will know that I work a lot with that image. It's in the introduction and the exiting sequence of every single program. It's an image I happen to have designed.
Absolutely.
I think of it as my own personal godhead archetype in a way.
Exactly. And that's what's interesting about the book. It is the God that he's referring to is really the true self, so to speak, and that and so I thought it was very that was very startling, and that felt like a kind of a numinous encounter or message.
I might just mention parenthetically for our regular viewers, I do have a program interview scheduled coming up in the coming weeks on the Godhead archetype.
Yes.
So with James P. Driscoll, the author of The Unfolding God of Jung and Milton. So we're going to pursue that topic. The Godhead archetype is very much related to archetypal synchronistic resonance.
Absolutely.
And that seems to have been the message there.
That was the message, absolutely. In a way, it's sort of the ultimate archetype.
It's as if the universe is trying to contribute to our theoretical model.
That's right. That's certainly how it felt to me. It was hard for me to just say, well, it was just chance. And I think that's where now, kind of getting back to our earlier discussion about how others might interpret it. Just viewing that as sort of a chance kind of occurrence. Certainly one could view it that way.
Well, hardcore skeptics would say there's no such thing as meaningful causal connections.
Right, exactly.
They don't occur. Those are all random.
That's right.
And that to the extent that they seem meaningful, it's because we're projecting meaning on them, not that there's any meaning intrinsic to the situation. That's the skeptical view. And they even go so far as to say there's a certain pathology called apophenia, which is a schizophrenic symptom. Schizophrenics believe sometimes that everything is meaningful. You turn on the radio and God is speaking to
you.
And so it's they would go so far as to say that people who report synchronicities, especially many, and I can tell you my life has been shaped by many synchronicities.
Yes, absolutely.
In any case, that's how I'm doing this video interview with you now, how I became a accredited parapsychologist, all through what seems to me to be synchronistic guidance.
Absolutely.
Probably another way to put it, maybe guidance from my own higher self. But in any case, to the skeptic, apophenia is a danger.
Right. It is. And they would say, well, look, even things that, even the things that are remotely that can only happen in the most remote circumstances do occasionally happen. So occasionally you do have these things happen, and occasionally you do win the lottery. That doesn't mean that God chose you to win the lottery, but that would be sort of, I think, the standard dismantling of our experiences here recounted. But that didn't work for me after actually having that experience, especially with the book. That felt like a special sort of stamp for me of something, a stamp of authenticity. I couldn't dismiss it that way. I was aware of that objection. I was aware of that way of thinking, but for whatever reason, that didn't seem congruent with, I guess, some deep processing.
Still, as a psychologist, it's important to be mindful.
It's important to be mindful
of the
that
possibility
there is that possibility
of apophenia.
Absolutely.
And in fact, in part 3 of our 3-part series, we'll go into much more depth about it.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, Brendan, our half hour is nearly over once again. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank
Pleasure
you so
for me
much.
as well. Thank you. I really appreciate this.
And thank you for being with us. Be sure to check your listings for part 3 of our 3-part series on archetypal synchronistic resonance.